learned about social, either from your involvement in this exercise or more generally over the last, let's say, 2 years? What do you know and believe now which is different from what you knew and believed before 2 years ago?
Quite a lot, so I'll try and narrow it down a little bit. I think the biggest thing for me is that actually being involved in this piece of work and the build-up to the creation of the report has actually been, even just talking about the notion of measuring rather than counting has enabled me to have a much more commercial conversation with our board of directors. I think I've said at a previous IPA Social Works event, little embarrassed to say it, but when I first walked into the boardroom, I was faced with quite a few middle-aged white men who are used to their teenage children using social media to chat to their friends, which I think was also referenced earlier. So what this piece of work has enabled me to do is actually change that conversation and have a much more commercial conversation, just based on the theory of being able to measure something differently and link it to the business strategy. So we talk about reducing costs, growth in sales, improvement of customer service, and improvement of our brand reach. And every time we talk about social, we talk about those four things, which has completely changed the conversation.
And that's over what time period has that change happened?
Probably over sort of 11 months, 12 months.
Okay, so it's very, very recent.
So, yeah,
very recent. And by the way, I'm someone who thinks there should be a moratorium on people referring to their kids' alleged media consumption. A 10-year moratorium on this. You have this. Is there anyone from BT here?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, BT are sort of notorious. Okay, so there's, my daughter Agatha, she's 18 months, she's on Facebook, all this sort of stuff. Okay, no. Let's be evidence-based. Let's look at data. Simeon, what have you learned in the last year or two?
I think I mentioned it a bit earlier on. I see this this change in culture from collecting data to interpreting data as being the big change that I can see to begin to happen. And I think it's a very long change. I think it's going to take us a very long time to go through that cultural change. But actually, with a lot of our clients now, they're talking about employing more analysts as well, because the data actually inside the client organisation is confusing. You can't just have one number anymore and just say, well, that's brand equity. There are lots of different signals. And I think that that's beginning to really significantly change the way that agencies relate to clients, who does what, where does the data sit. And I think there's a very, very big organisational change which is occurring. Social isn't the only reason that's happening, but it's actually one of the main first reasons to agitate.
And that's actually a bit similar to what Jenny was saying, in the sense that what you're analysing is much closer to commercial and outcomes and so on.
Yes, absolutely.
And you're talking to the old white men using the language of business. Ray?
I think the thing that really surprised me but shouldn't have done is you get what you pay for. There's a sort of feeling that social media is this great place. If you don't have any budget, you do something inspirational and you get it really for free almost, or for very little money. And when you look at it, it's really more about paid media. The paid platforms are driving all the process through. And we move into then targeting. And guess what? Targeting isn't nearly as effective as we think it is, and you only get what you pay for. It's one of those things that markets do, and so it shouldn't have been a surprise. But when you start looking at things like homophily that Simeon was talking about earlier, you see why there are no silver bullets. Once in a while, there's two great case studies, Philippines and Iceland, where they were able to achieve that, and there were great things in other campaigns in the past, the Cadbury Gorilla. But nearly always, you get what you pay for. And if you go into social with, this is going to be a really cheap way of doing it, you're not going to get as much out of it.
And it's particularly the role of paid in driving it in most cases, and therefore the synergy.
Yeah, because there's always an arms race.
Yes.
You're really creative here, you're really creative there. Which is more likely to win? The one that gets the biggest push.
Yes.
Is going to drive it through.
Yeah.
I suppose what I've been learning over the last 18 months of reading a lot of these cases is I think the market is starting to move. As the industry is starting to invest a lot more in social media, then the money men that Jenny was talking about it, are looking for more return and more evidence of return. And that investment is only going to come if the measurement and the robust analytics are there. So I think over the last year or so, there has been an slight increase in the quality of the cases that we've started to get. And that is a direct measure of the investment going into it and the request, therefore, from businesses to get more data.
And what's interesting for me about this is, social, the hype about social, I mean, how long have we had hype about social? I mean, 10 years, whatever, okay? But what all four of you have talked about is actually quite recent.
Yeah.
That there's a sort of next stage which is more grown up.
Yeah.
You're using the language of business and management, not the language of clicks and so on. You're starting to measure outcomes, not just clicks.
And actually also people, brands have hired people that are responsible solely for looking at this data. And they have started to, their influence has got wider in the organisation. Witness.
And we have, I mean, so your role was head of social, is that
Yes,
right?
that's right.
And it's now head of brand.
Yes.
Okay, including social. Okay, so this sign of the times, the other sides of that are you get what you pay for, and as we get more grown up about this, so you're dealing more with the CFOs and people. We have to start providing better evidence and data in order to justify this having a larger role. That was my question one. My question two, apart from the volcano, that is. My question two to the panel, starting with Simeon, is if you're talking to a client that's sort of behind the curve, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them to start getting up to speed on?
I think probably, whether they were behind the curve or not, the one piece of advice we give any client is to watch out who you're giving your data to at the moment. So as a sort of media person, you can see that actually there's a lot of the platforms are media owners, and actually they are sucking in your data to work out how effective it is for you, and they're going to charge you prices for that. And actually, if we don't watch out, there is a very, very significant change in the way the landscape will shape up, which is not necessarily in the interest of clients if we watch out. So that my piece of advice, whether behind the curve or right ahead of it, is watch out, because the world is changing quickly on information is power.
And money.
And money,
Yes.
a lot of it.
Now, Jenny, you've actually been through this because you had to drive it at RSA. So what's the one thing you'd pick out to advise a company?
I think it's not being naive that social media is the kind of silver bullet to everything, but actually using social media and the data you get to influence other things. So a brilliant example for us would be the test and learn that we've been running from a customer service perspective, and how actually we've had to use data from that to influence processes and policies that sit within our customer service function, our claims function, to live up to the expectations of social media. So, gone are the days when people are quite happy to sit on hold into the call centre waiting half an hour or so to get a response on something, particularly with Twitter, as we all know, preaching to the converted, it's instant. How can you make promises instantly if actually your processes and policies aren't keeping up with that? So that's probably been my biggest learning, is not to be naive to it and make sure that you're influencing all parts of the business to live up to that expectation.
And the market getting more demanding because of it, Fran?
I would say, as Simeon said before, about instigating a culture of test and learn, but also developing some analysis skills that not only can analyse sets of data, separate sets of data, but can start to think about how to crunch data sets together. Just as Simeon was saying about the future being much more about analysis rather than the skill being the collecting of the data, you have to start to build skills internally that can crunch the data together and then produce some insight from it.
I would start by telling them to read the 13 case studies, because the thing they're going to be struck by there is you can make a lot of extra money in terms of either increased sales or reduce costs. Look at the BT case study. A lot of the savings are reduced costs as opposed to increased revenue. So there's a lot of money to be made by doing it right, which means you need to measure it. So you can measure it. If you look at the case studies, there's varying degrees of quality of measurement in those studies, but you can do it. So taking on board that you can do that and thinking about changing sales and brand value, as opposed to, I went to a conference for a leading international drinks company last year, and they got KPIs based on the number of likes. Well, having a KPI based on sales caused by change of the number of likes would have been fine, but not just the number of likes. And I think that companies are moving on from that now to say social has to be linked to the objectives of business. And that's what you'll see in the case studies. Although they probably retrofitted them sometimes.
Well, that happens, yes. Okay. I'm going to open it up to you guys now. I hope you've got some questions. If you have, can you please say who you are? Okay, sure.
Paul Edwards. Paddy, you talked earlier about... I've got a microphone. I've got a loud voice. You talked earlier about crashing into the friends in the pub with your advertising message, and Stephen talked about all the different collaborators in this area.
Yes.
Whose responsibility is it to make sure that we don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg? We don't ruin the opportunity that is social?
Panel.
I was going to say, I'd start off by trying to find out in the organisation who has access to and creates social data. And first of all, take the map of where all this data is sitting in the organisation, whether it's customer guys or the sales guys themselves, or where all that is, and pull that together. But I mean, with my marketing society hat on, I'm going to say the marketer, because if it's a truly marketing-driven function, then they should own the customer services relationship and the research relationship and all of that. So I'm going to say the CMO, as long as they have responsibility in all of those areas.
I think that the other sort of wrinkle is that when you make mistakes, first of all, you need to know you've made a mistake. And so your sort of sensing needs to be good, as always with customer focus, and then you need to respond very well to making a mistake. Other comments on that? I mean, because you've had to deal with this, presumably, you've had practical issues. Are you able to tell us the worst story, or you can?
Oh my goodness, put me on the spot now. I've got a response there sort of more directly to the question. I think it plays even more into measuring, not counting, because actually, if you're speaking to the right audience and you really care about the followership you're building up and they're the right people, actually you run the risk of doing this less. If that's right. I don't know if anybody's heard of the story about Burger King in Scandinavia, where they actually went out of their way to actually test their followers by giving them a free McDonald's meal voucher. Because actually they were really brave and actually wanted the right followers, not kind of a mass of followers. And I think it's about getting your communities right and making sure you are communicating to the right people.
But you also have you have a challenge in financial services, A, because of the complexity, and B, because most normal people don't find the products very interesting in their own right.
Well,
so they may
no
come
one
to you for
wants a
functional
relationship
reasons. Exactly.
with their insurance provider, do they? Not really. It's one of those purchases you make reluctantly and hope you never use. So we're looking at ways of how we support our customers by giving them advice on how actually they don't have to make a claim in the first place. So tapping into communities, for example, that big lovers of pets, and we found a big issue with claims is pet obesity. So how can we help customers using social at the right time to prevent them having to make a claim? That saves us money and the customer.
So it's overwhelmingly practical in that case. It's
Massively.
not an emotional thing in its own right. It's practical help,
Practical, yeah.
which has value for them. Simeon.
I mean, I would agree with Fran. I think that ultimately it's the CMO within the organisation who ultimately has to be able to take charge of that. I think what is really interesting though is even now, particularly in service organisations, the marketing function has been spread, throughout the organisation, probably quicker than we anticipated it was going to happen. And I think that that's quite interesting, again, from the agency side, about how actually we still have an organisation that tends to address only one part of the people now involved in marketing in the organisation. And I think that's also a challenge for agencies, how to
I think that's a sort of generic issue about marketing, that, you know, the sort of classic marketing is FMCG, and, you know, the manufacture and marketing of FMCG is maybe 5% of a modern economy. Okay, so 70% of the economy is services, but you can go to Waterstones and there are books called Services Marketing, as if this is a sort of slightly obscure niche activity, which, you know, B2B, which is, you know, 20% of the economy or whatever.
When I go to a market research conference, they will tell you that the market researchers should be the home of it. Occasionally I go to sit for the Chartered Institute of Public Finance Accountants with a different hat on, and they feel very much that they should be in control of this. The PR people absolutely think that this is theirs. And the COOs in a lot of organisations, because if you are using social to deliver a service like TFLR, like BTR, then in fact, the marketing aspect of social is not the biggest aspect of social. So we're going to have, this is where the 7 takeaways, the siloed approaches, it can't be owned in a single place. Social is now right across the board. Who's going to own writing within the organisation? Who's going to own thinking in the organisation? Owning social is the same sort of thing.
I mean, I think it's sort of, your question particularly relates to a situation where someone, maybe low down in the organisation, is engaging in dialogue, which is kind of off message, or something goes wrong, or it was more generic. It was more.
Because it sounded like an answer from the good guy.
Yes.
And I was envisaging a bad guy coming along and doing unpleasant things, using social in an inappropriate way,
Okay.
and thereby ruining it for everyone.
Yes.
Not just the company that's doing it.
Okay.
You have control over that.
Okay. Yes. Next question. Another back here.
Hi, I'm Elle from Karmarama.
From.
Karmarama,
Okay.
we wrote the Oncom paper.
One of the contributors, in fact.
Oh, right.
My question was going to be around what Ray's just touched on, which is basically that we're in a really interesting but complicated time in our industry right now where should it be a social media agency, should it be a through-the-line creative agency, should it be a media agency, or should it be done internally is a question that everyone's asking of social media. I think I imagine that the panel members will have very different answers to that question. I think we all know that the answer is that everyone needs to work together and make sure that there's sort of a single point that all the data.
Are you thinking of social media for marketing communications, or?
But yes, exactly. So, you know, it has to remain internal when social is providing a service. But yeah, if it is for traditional marketing communications, if it is to be held up against TV as the new hero medium, right now, in the state of the industry now, who do you think is best placed to be owning it, delivering it,
Ray,
measuring it?
Start?
Yeah, well, at different parts. The measurement is going to be best placed with one of the key measurement agencies. You're obviously going to talk to the platforms. If you've got a degree of creativity in it, God, I hope you have, then you're going to have to be talking to people who can supply that. It probably doesn't matter too much who the lead agency or whether the lead unit is internal or external. They need to know that they are the lead, and you need to measure performance. But it's going to be multidisciplinary teams. One of the great things about my age and Paddy's age is when we enter this industry, you could actually know the whole of market research and marketing. It was about 3 textbooks. Now, you can probably know 1%. It's all about working in teams, but somebody has to manage. Somebody has to be in charge.
And also, somebody has to be setting the objectives. You know, the person that's setting the objectives is the person who has to be accountable for those objectives. So it's wherever that lies, I would say.
And their business objectives.
Yeah.
Anything else to add?
No, I would just amplify what Ray said, which is I think increasingly the way the day-to-day control will be where people can analyse and use the data, because often it's a conversation which is increasingly facilitated through being able to do that. And actually that skill is incredibly scarce. So if you then think of all the people you mentioned and you think, really, who can actually use the data as opposed to just kind of flapping at it? And there probably aren't even enough people to do that. So whilst it might seem we've got too many agencies, actually in some ways I think we've got not enough skill.
It is also often who actually has the data.
Yep.
Often our
Yep.
CMOs might not have their sales data, for example, or it might not be updated.
And hence my point as well about the role of the platforms in this, because about whose data, the commons is also protected by who has the commons of the data and the knowledge. And I think one of the things we might touch on is a role for the industry body, not just about the privacy issues but also just about protecting data rights. Because at the moment you could see some very powerful people might suddenly put their arm around it, and then all of a sudden we all know a lot less.
I think there's going to be some very interesting battles for ownership of that data between the single source, the panel companies. I was talking to a telco today. They're using femtocells to get a lot of information about how you're using your phone. They're putting them into supermarkets, and the data is owned by the telco. So they could then sell that to a competitive supermarket, which is like, why on earth are the supermarkets cooperated with that degree? Flurry putting bits of code onto your smartphone so they can tell where you are when you play Candy Crush, and giving that again to third parties and so on. The depth of knowledge we're giving Google. I was driving up the M1 the other day. First time for about 5 years I was driving up the M1. I dropped off my partner at Heathrow, and I got a Google message saying, there's a blockage between junction 16 and 18. It worked out who I was. I was probably going home. I live in Nottingham. I might be interested in this message. It's fascinating, or creepy.
Next question. Yes. Do you want to wait for a mic at the? And again, say who you are.
Hello, I'm Rob, Head of Social Strategy at Adam & Eve DDB, and I asked this question at my peril because I work with Les Binet, but does the panel think that econometrics always sufficiently picks up all of the effects of social?
I think the short answer is no, but we'll ask for a slightly longer answer. Okay, starting with Simeon.
No. No, I don't think it does. And I think that actually, whilst as I mentioned, I think the gold standard approach we should start moving towards is one which is both has an experimental aspect to it and a modelling aspect to it. So in the social fundamentally challenges a lot of the things that modelling does, these sort of implicit assumptions, the nature of the data, and it's, but actually the sort of experimental A/B testing approach is often just as hides as many implicit assumptions as well. So I think bringing the two things together is really what matters. And the secret to that, I think, is still going to be increasingly in analysing the data at a more granular respondent level. So you need to have a series of things because no one approach is best. But actually, the traditional MMM model, as we've seen in lots of other areas, is actually is pretty challenged actually by this. But in the context we often want the answer, the way that you want the answer, which is not what happened, but how do I repeat it? And I think that's the context which is changing, which a lot of the stuff that we've done, there's a long history in the IPA, is reasonably being answering the question of, now I've finished, what happened? But not to influence a decision now. And I think that's the context where a lot of people in social are saying, yeah, but how do I repeat that? Who do I target? What sort of content do I want? And those are the sort of questions which are I think, evolving the nature of measurement.
Well, Rob, was there a particular reason behind your questions?
Well, one of Les's models.
No, but I think it's just, I just think it just feels that often econometricians are used to modelling purely on sales, or let's say modelling against the traditional media and consumer response to mass market media. So it's about, I'd like to understand, say, if we're working with econometricians or briefing them, if there are any particular guidelines that we should use in briefing them, interpreting their data, and so on, to make sure that
but also, I mean, even traditional econometrics, you know, in order to make them the models tractable, you're assuming linearities. You're not, you know, synergy is hard to model. Non-linear relationships are hard to model, and all of that. And I think we sort of have that in spades in this case.
Yes, that's right. And I think in the guide you'll see we've got a list of exactly what you say, which is how should I brief my econometrician to get the most out of it. And there's been a lot of work, particularly in the US, where people have looked at different models and said, you know, what's the data input got to look like if I want to be able to measure it? I mentioned that with the Nielsen stuff. So you can begin to then say, yes, what do I expect from it? I think I would go back to saying that a lot of what the traditional modelling approach has been is being set up to answer a question which probably isn't the question that you have. And so the fundamental difference is you probably want them to answer something which is slightly different, which is how does this work and how do I repeat it? Not just, you know, that campaign we ran last year, what was the ROI of it? Yeah. And I think that's the difference. And that's why, in a way, the analysts are becoming much more central to what you do.
I would say two things. One is literally in the last year, I'd say we've only started to get some really good modelling cases through in the project because they've only had like 2 years of data. And it's only when you've got that level of data that you can really start to do some really good modelling. And I also think that the modelling agencies will start evolving the way that they adapt, and they will adapt the models. We've seen from the Lysol case the way that they've changed their approach to make sort of social fit in. So I've got a lot of confidence in the industry that they will work out a way of doing it, I suppose.
Right. I mean, yes, most models are either underspecified or overspecified, and in here we've got a problem of what have we missed altogether. So you've got all of your variables you think are knowing happening. Turns out the HR department have been running a massive social campaign to try to attract new graduates into your industry, and that's had an effect. Well, obviously you've not got it as an input variable. It's not going to be in the process. So the first step is it won't always, it's never going to be right. One of the things that became apparent, and we got into a bit of a circular hole at one stage, is that mine tweaking or something else's, which is if you look hard enough at any measurement process, I really don't think that's me. Is it somebody else? Maybe it's me. Okay.
Yeah, must be.
If you look hard enough at any measurement process, you can start to pick a hold on it. So you have to back off and say, this is probably right. This is taking me in the right direction. But there's a line in the guide which is put in by Simeon, which I think is a great one, which is make people make predictions. That is a really good way of finding out how good stuff is. Get them to make a prediction.
Next question. Yes. Here in the aisle. Can we have
Hi, my name is Gerard from AMV BBDO.
Oh, right, yes.
So what I've been hearing is a lot of measurement as a reactive bit of information, and so it's a lot of measurement to see what happened. What we're interested in at AMV is using social media to predict what's going to happen, to create content and other campaigns. So for instance, can we understand what the next ice bucket is so we can create different types of content for our clients? Have you seen in your case studies examples of companies using social data as signals to predict what's going to happen and then create products or services or content as a result?
To be honest, we haven't seen much prediction so far. I think it's coming. And as I said before, I think the modelling companies are starting to do that. And actually, we could probably ask Selena if the Lysol case has got prediction in it. Has it, Selena? Yet? Oh, actually, that's true as well.
Yes,
yes,
the IBM.
Sorry. Whether there's one of the Lysol case which has quite a complex model. It's based on the US data. I think that might have some predictive element within it.
That one in particular doesn't have any prediction in. But I've worked on other case studies where we have looked primarily at using social data to predict success or predict sales, not specifically looking at particular creative approaches, but looking at what the predictive sales of a new product launch might be based on social data.
What about using social data for insight, which leads you to modify existing?
Well,
that
I was
happens a
gonna say,
lot,
yes.
doesn't it?
There's about three
That's
categories.
true.
Yeah.
And so within market research, that's a big one. So
Yes.
there's a whole set of underarm deodorants, the white on white, the black on black, were all
Yes.
developed out of social media listings. Swarovski, the Crystal sort of company have done a lot in terms of ideation, finding ideas, developing trends. That works well. What Simeon was talking about earlier, Yanni Hoffmeyer and the TNS stuff, that is quite interesting in terms of predicting where the brand strength and the brand equity is moving. That tends to be, however, very much inside the box. What nobody is doing is being able to spot that this is going to go viral in the sense of the ice bucket, because the chance element is so massive to the predictable element. And when you get people looking at that, and there is one where they started using expert panels, looking at YouTube videos, it was negligible, the success. It is probably not predictable. It probably is chaotic.
But Ray, your first point was, to the earlier question was you get what you pay for, and presumably becomes more predictable, the more money you put behind it, in a traditional way.
No.
Is that not the case?
Nate Silver, Signal in the Noise, really good read, contrasts weather forecasting and earthquake forecasting.
Yes.
Weather forecasting is getting better and better and better, believe it or not.
Yes.
And the more money you spend on it, the better we get at weather forecasting. The more money you spend on earthquake forecasting, it doesn't get any better because we can't forecast it.
And you think social is like...
No. I think things like the Ice Bucket Challenge are so unpredictable, they're chaotic events, that actually the best you can do, and there are some people who've looked into this quite a lot, is early listening, rapid spotting, agile reacting.
It's a bit like your Icelandic volcano, actually.
And also like the no makeup selfie from the cancer campaign, where they responded really, really quickly and generated, was it £8 million in 4 weeks? And
so a lot of it's speed.
Yes, a lot of it is speed, yes.
And I think that's where the modelling stuff comes in, because it is about speed and often about granularity. So I think to your point, is there are quite a lot of occasions when it's not the Ice Bucket Challenge and it's not a worldwide phenomena, which is just, will this content at this time, round about now, be good enough or better than another strategy? And actually I think there's quite a lot of cases where that is, people can do that and be reasonably predictive. And I think that's a lot of where social is right now. And it's quite interesting, the sort of implicit point you've made, which is, as an industry, we're quite good at justifying what we've done, which is we don't tend to surface knowledge about how do I use data better to actually do something now to be predictive. And there's a lot of analytical techniques that are going around which, I think as an industry would be very good for us to get our heads around them. And in fact, one of the reasons why we got together around this social stuff was really because a lot of people were saying the same things, which is it feels there's something in it, but I'm not quite sure if it's just me, but I can't quite find it yet. And I think as an industry, we've come together and said, well, actually, we're all in the same position, and this is a great position. This is a great place for us to actually learn together, and not, again, as I say, have the vendors necessarily learning on our behalf. And the issue that you raise, which is about moving it from a justification to a how do I use data and analytics and insight to affect what I do next, I think is where that debate should shift to. And I've seen quite a few things where people are beginning to do that, as I'm sure you have, some of which I don't know whether they're true or not. It's hard for us to verify, but they're all beginning to be quite interesting in terms of my task is to understand how to put the right content, refer to the right person at the right time, for average, for everyday marketing and conversations. And data is definitely at the heart of that.
And I think some of the cases do demonstrate that that particular strategies can help an organisation to predict what they need to do next. Like the IBM case that's going to be up hopefully at the end of the week will demonstrate that their change of strategy has delivered a huge return for them. So they need to carry on with that, and if they carry on with that, they can predict a number of sales leads that's going to be X over the next year. So it's not really sort of specific strategy.
RSA, you haven't used social to predict sales of new products, presumably, or have you done that?
We've started having a look at it. So key life events can be indicators when looking at data for either saving business or an opportunity for business growth.
Right.
I'd say the other thing we've looked at is weather events as well. So obviously that has a big impact on our bottom line, and we want to support our customers. So if we know there's a big weather event coming and we can see a particular community of people that are talking about that, how can we help them before you know, they actually get into a
And
situation
you've
where they
modified
complain.
products presumably as well in response. That kind of happens at the margin all the time, I would have thought.
Yeah, absolutely.
So service quality.
Just connecting the two the 2 points actually. So we've seen about the data and predictive and where social sits. So we've seen a very, very large brand in the US which said, actually, because I want to predict content and first-party data is the only real way of doing that to connect it with social, I'm going to bring all social in-house. And so they got rid of all of their agency relationships and brought it all in because of the nature of the data and to do what you were suggesting, which is to predict content better. And first-party data being the thing that really does that better than anything else.
One, just to follow
Okay, sure,
up.
yeah.
So one follow-up on that is, are we actually looking at the right numbers? How are we defining success? So, for instance,
In terms of data or in terms of measures?
in terms of data, is the data that we're looking at actually the right type of data? So, for instance, as a creative agency, we're looking for content that's really influential, that has a way to scale, to reach as many people and change different types of opinions. Is looking at shifts in conversations numbers-wise in terms of influence, or did a blogger change their opinion on something that we previously wanted to change their opinion on, do that?
I think that
Is
has
that
a
a better
bit of a
metric?
parallel to what you were both saying about the fact that because there are all these numbers and you can do, test and learn at sort of micro level, there's a danger of forgetting you're also in the brand business. Do you want to, is that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that comes back to the point, I'm sure that Ray will jump in on the role of influencers.
Yeah.
So I think that sometimes because we can in social, we've looked at small groups of people that we can see changing, bloggers, whatever. Whereas actually one of the interesting things from the research is it's the early adopters who are the people we can often influence, and that's almost a mass marketing job. So moving it from a sort of PR mentality to our traditional mentality, which is thinking about the brand and scale and reach and culture, is I think where the data should play out. And how do you do that at scale? So it's moving it from that PR little stuff to bigger ways of saying we want to do that, bigger numbers now.
The only way you can answer that question, though, is absolutely knowing that your social strategy is underpinning your business strategy, because then that leads you to understand what are the right measures to be looking at. So there's always a why are you doing something, there's always a reason. And it's got to be underpinned by those business measures, ultimately.
Final question, yes. In the aisle here.
Thanks. It's Steve Thompson from Keller Fay. Well, we've touched on this a little bit about the role of influencers and this sort of holy grail almost of trying to find them. So I wonder I think Ray, probably you've looked at this. Perhaps you can amplify this a little bit. But in particular, in social, is there a danger we're always looking for, in effect, the same thing, the equivalent of a silver bullet, one person who's going to tell the world, whereas in fact influencers are there, but we should be being realistic about the scale of them and the number of them.
It's very much about the scale. We had a great contribution actually from Dave Keller, amongst many others, and then what's with his very much more cynical view, and singing around more in the middle, that there is influence, but it is much smaller, and that social influence isn't one of the biggest influences around there. What we cook is more likely to be impacted by Nigella on the TV than it is somebody else tweeting what they've been picking for their meal or the rest of it. And I've got this analogy to anybody here from places like Clout or whatever, for a lot of what they're doing. Imagine that you've got the data about a flu outbreak in the UK for last year. Let's call the people who caught the flu first the early adopters, the influential people. Well, now we're trying to predict what happens next year, so we're going to assume that the influencers are going to be the first people to get it this year. But actually, we're not selling flu, we're selling measles. But we don't have a measles model, so we'll use the flu model. That's what a lot of the current social media influencer models are like. They're based on something that happened, and they're looking at it, and we can see, it's like you look at the ink blots and you can see a pattern. And then you say, well, that's the pattern, and now we'll apply that for a whole range of things. It's much more subtle than that, and it's smaller than that, but it does exist.
Any other comments on that? Well, we've hit 8 o'clock. I think my duty now is to thank our panel very much. Okay. That's terrific.